Welcome back to Teaching World History. Just a reminder, this is what the workbook looks like. I'm reminding you this and showing this because there's more than one edition. And I want to be clear, that's why you're confused. You're with the wrong edition. Today we're looking at humanism. Humanism comes to define the Western identity, Western in quotes, because Western is a relative term, and humanism is not only used in the West, and it's applied in other places. And what does Western mean anyway? But 1500 to 1900, and the pages are 105 to 117. This is an important section. In fact, this chapter was used by more professors around the country than the book was used. In other words, I had several professors write me over the years and ask if I would mind if they adopted parts of this chapter, particularly the part where I go through the eras of humanism, and then with a project or two. I can't endorse that because the editors and publisher worked very hard to make this a lovely book and a single thing, and it's a fair price. This is one of the reasons that I did it in the first place, is because the book is a GE textbook that I knew that I could do for a fair price. But still, I'm pleased that people are using it because I think this material is very important, and it reflects back and kind of completes a number of the projects and questions that we've already addressed in this book, particularly on equality, humanism, citizenship, reason, justice, all of those elements that really come up again and again in discussion of historical method, historical authenticity, and so on. So the chapter opens with a sort of a follow-up definition, a working definition. I want students to have a clear definition of humanism that's consistent with the humanist developments. So it would be a little bit qualified, since obviously Greeks had a different definition of humanism than I think most 21st century Germans and Spaniards and Mexicans and Japanese and Koreans. I mean, humanism is really, at least in law, in constitutions, is really prevailing through much of the world. So what this chapter does also is outline, obviously very briefly, but again, this is just the tip. Then if students want to get deeper, or if the professor or instructor wants to get deeper, or if you want to get deeper into the material, you can, and you have a good outline to know where to begin and what is the framework under which you're working. What are the broad parameters of these terms and of these developments? So what I've done is I've taken what are conventionally the five major developments, at least pre-industrial developments of humanism, that came out of humanism, that were associated with humanism, that were part of the humanist struggle for recognition, you could say. Not that humanism struggled, but the humanists struggled. And those are the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, and the French Revolution. Obviously, humanism didn't end with the French Revolution. Humanism continued to produce the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, capitalism, in many respects, globalization, and so on, right up until the modern time. All of this is, but humanism really, as a basic principle, along with the scientific method, which is humanist, transformed the human world, transformed the way that humans live. The world became so much different because of humanist thought, because of understanding of the individual, of reason, of the scientific method, and all of those things. So obviously these are way too brief, But that's kind of the danger of a GE world history class or course. The Renaissance, I took Pico as kind of a model of the Renaissance. I believe there's a better model, but Pico has this beautiful quote that I think summarizes kind of a number of principles of humanism that are central to the thinking all the way through and are very modern and very recognizable to 21st century students. And that quote is on page 106. And one of the important elements of this quote is that the voice is of God. This is God addressing human beings. And I think that I think it's important and really essential to understand humanism to appreciate that the humanists, for the most part, believed in a God who created human beings, and a God who created human beings free with reason or conscience, is essentially the same thing, and as individuals. And again, those terms are variable and applied variably through the centuries, but those terms are still defensible through all of the humanist development. So I know people don't like to read block quotes. Block quote is an opportunity to skip ahead and make some progress in your reading without reading. But this block quote is I think is powerful, and it really demonstrates the idea that man is the measure of all things. That doesn't mean that there is no God. That means that man is the measure of all things because no longer are we following matters of faith or following science and understanding of the universe and the physical world on the basis of faith, but on the basis of reason. And that humans can elevate themselves, which is basically what Pico says, that humans are not helpless worms who are born into sin and can do nothing about their condition. In fact, the humanist says humans can do something about their condition. This does reflect back on the ancient Athenian principles of humanism, and the heroic man in particular, that the heroic man seizes his own fate, and he can, if he needs to defy the gods, he will defy the gods, defy his fate, defy nature, defy the conditions of the world around him, and seize his fate or die. And when he does that, he is acting like a humanist. Pico kind of says this. Pico says if a person does what's right, what's correct, what's good, that the person then becomes elevated and brings society along with him or her. And with Pico, I'm not so sure that Pico had the same misogynistic segregation that the ancient Greeks had, which is refreshing. This begins to change a little bit and to make progress. The second is the Protestant Reformation. Obviously, Martin Luther is the towering figure of the Protestant Reformation. I think there's no question about that. An interesting thing about Luther is that Luther used essentially the same humanist method that Galileo used. So following Luther then is the scientific method, is the scientific revolution. Luther begins on page 107. Galileo begins on page 109 or 108. And with both of them, they both adopt this method, this humanist method that Jacob Bronowski, a famous commentator on history of science, describes as a three-step method. Modern scientific method is to build the apparatus, conduct the experiment, and publish the results. All three of those are essential. The third one is not incidental. Publish the results is very important. The apparatus with Galileo is clear. Galileo is the builder of his own apparatus, which was the telescope. His experiment was also clear. He examined the heavens. And publishing the results, this is also clear. Although he was forbidden to publish, it became, the Starry Messenger was published. And the word spread that the Earth is not the center of the universe. In fact, the Earth revolves around the sun. And in fact, Jupiter has moons that revolve around Jupiter. And so this changed the view of the world, and of course the Church resisted. Luther also uses that method. Luther uses the scientific method by building the apparatus, which was for Martin Luther was studying the Bible. And even though the Bible it's a matter of faith, accepting that the Bible is the Word of God, and that the Word of God is a statement of truth for humanity and contains all of the truth that humans need to operate and so on, it's still the same process. It's still the same method. Luther built the apparatus by really constructing the text of the Bible in a sense, not writing it, but translating and studying it. He conducted the experiment, which was to test the behavior of the church. And then he published the results, and Luther published all over the place. To publish the results is a requirement of humanists all the way through the revolutions and into the modern era. It's not an accident that all of the major humanist constitutions in the world, all of the modern democratic constitutions, include free press, free speech, freedom of association, because people need to exchange ideas. This is part of the humanist endeavor, is to exchange ideas, to test ideas against other people, to offer ideas. They're not contained in some secret archive in the Vatican. And I say the Vatican because obviously these movements came up against opposition from the church, but also from the state. But that doesn't mean that the humanists were anti-church and anti-state. They were only non-humanist churches and non-humanist states. So they are in opposition to kingdoms. They are in opposition to the Catholic Church or the Roman Church, and they supported. Obviously, Martin Luther was a person of great belief, great faith. For that matter, Galileo was too, and Pico as well. So they believed in government. Luther too much. If you're familiar with the events of 1525, the summer of 1525, then you are aware that Martin Luther did not like unruly, unlawful crowds. He thought that the princes should kill the peasants because the peasants were appealing to Martin Luther's own democratic principles, only they were applying them to society and to government, and Luther wouldn't have it. Because each of these developments really is discrete in its own field, in its own area. They're not sweeping. These aren't all modern 21st century proponents of democratic societies and institutions. Only of some institutions in the way that those people did their work. So Luther was a theologian. He was a priest. And he ended up being essentially the head of a new church. But he was not a politician, and he was not a scientist. So he had different ideas. He was a big proponent of mass education. So students need to be careful with this. These people were all humanists, but they were not all the same humanists, and they were not all the same humanists that we are. They were different from us. Like the ancient Greeks, who would have said that females are not human. In the same way that males are human. Human females have no sense of reason. As incredible as that could sound. So the passages that the Catholic Church used against Galileo a couple of them are included in this reading. And I think that it's very helpful for students to recognize that sacred texts don't always necessarily mean automatically what they appear to mean. And I ask my students, what do modern scientifically thinking humanist Jews, Muslims, and Christians do with some of these texts? And I get some interesting answers, and I think it's a thoughtful question, and it's helpful for students. Obviously, there are people who continue to believe that the Bible is the sacred, authentic Word of God. And they also believe that the earth revolves around the sun. How do they reconcile those two? It's a wonderful conversation. It's a historical conversation. It's the application of these ideas and principles and arguments into a real life discussion, a discussion that still survives today. These debates continue and persist with issues of the clash of science and faith. Then comes the Enlightenment and the philosophes, and finally the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the French Revolution. The French Revolution is a kind of a neater application. This is a world history text, and it doesn't completely shun American issues, but just because of the organization of departments and disciplines around the United States, at least, it's conventional to separate the American history from world history. So there's kind of a practical reason why the United States is not mentioned as much in this book as is the rest of the world. But there's another reason, and that is that the American Revolution had some serious problems with it that were very unenlightened. I mean, they had some very unenlightened practices, particularly regarding slavery, slaves, Native Americans, as well as women. French Revolution had plenty of problems of its own, but not those problems. Well, they had the problem of women, I think, and I know there are French historians who argue that the French Revolution was in fact maybe a step forward for humanism, but a step backward for women. So they all had problems. They were not pure. They were not perfect. I tell my students that the enlightened philosophers were probably the most enlightened of any of these people, and that many of the philosophers were probably more enlightened in their sense of, in their understanding of equality and opportunity and so on, more enlightened than modern people, than 21st century people. I think there were philosophers who objected to nations and to tribes and to all kinds of things like that. So the question then, at the end of this brief reading, and then including in with that from the appendix, is the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which a lot of students will recognize from whatever country they arrive here from, because it's a fairly standard humanist democratic constitution. It follows the same principles of protection of the individual, protection of freedom. I mean, there are some more modern elements to, for example, the European Union statements on human rights, but the core elements are constant through those eras. Project 21 on page 111. This, I think, is to some people this question is so obvious it's not necessary, but to a lot of American students that isn't the case, and also students from other parts of the world. But I think principally American students. This is I think one of the most important projects in the book. It's so important that students understand the answer to this question. And the question is, many students today maintain that truth is relative to the degree that if people believe something to be true, it is true for them. I understand that true for them has sort of a dual meaning, but when people use that, well, that's what you believe, then it's true for you. Well, I believe that, so it's true for me. That's quite a common statement. This is what I was referring to earlier in a previous video, where I said that I really believe that freedom is probably the most abused term in the English language, the American English language at least. Because really, in fact, to function in a democracy, to function as a modern professional society, people are not free to believe whatever they want, and obviously if they believe something, it's not any more true for them than it is for anyone else, unless it's true. That the humanists use the word freedom a lot, but the humanists are strict thinkers. All of these humanists are very strict thinkers. Luther is one of the strictest thinkers. The French revolutionaries, Galileo, these are really strict thinkers. Galileo was absolutely convinced that when he showed the church leaders and the Pope personally his evidence for his construction of the solar system, that they would accept it, because it was, to Galileo, it's true. That's right. Here's the evidence. Here's the layout. Here I have the whole thing. I'm exchanging the ideas. I've done the research. What's to argue? There may be issues around the edges, and come to find out, Galileo wasn't entirely true. The sun isn't the center of the universe at all. It's not even close. But that isn't the point. The point is that there's an open exchange of ideas, and as evidence comes in, then the humanists are convinced that there is a correct and an incorrect, and the correct and the incorrect will be demonstrated objectively. This is how the scientific method works, and then the individual is free to choose that, but not really free to not choose that. I mean, I think there's an excellent question. Why did Martin Luther translate the Bible? He didn't translate the Bible so that people would all be free to interpret it however they wanted. Not even close. I mean, it's so much harsher than that I can't even impress it enough. Martin Luther believed that if people were exposed to the Bible and drew wrong conclusions about their interpretations from the Bible, that they were greater sinners than those who had never seen the Bible in the first place. He believed that, and he taught that, and he wrote that. So they had very strict ideas, and by they, I mean really humanists across those centuries. Maybe not every humanist across those centuries, but in general, the humanist principle is pretty strict, because humanists argue that correct can be discovered, and this is very important to the humanist endeavor, because if correct cannot be discovered, if correct cannot be agreed on, then justice is a joke, and legal systems are a sham, and democracy is utterly foolish, because people need to be able to demonstrate objectively what's correct and what's incorrect, and people need to adopt that. Martin Luther translating the Bible, the principle was that all human beings, those Saxon-reading human beings, his fellow Saxons, should have the opportunity to read the Word of God. It wasn't to figure it out for themselves. It was to read it and to draw the correct conclusion, to come to an accurate, authentic, correct, divine conclusion. Now, Luther added into not just from reason, but also from divine inspiration and the Holy Spirit and those kinds of things. But nevertheless, there's a correct and an incorrect, and Galileo believed as well, and French revolutionaries believed this as well, and the philosophers believed this as well. There is a correct and an incorrect. Humans are born equal, humans are born free. That would be the correct conclusion. And their evidence for that is sometimes looking at themselves, sometimes looking at society, looking at the nature of people. So this question, I think, is very important to preempt or to combat what's already established with students' experience with the word freedom. The freedom is it's a touchy-feely word, it's a happy word, it's a nice word. We're all free, we can do what we want, we can choose whatever brand we like and whatever church we like and whatever family we want. But that isn't the humanist principle. The humanist principle is that you are obligated as a human being to choose right. And right means correct. And that's the idea. And that way society advances, society progresses. The law becomes improved. There is refinement. In his famous essay on what is enlightenment, Immanuel Kant makes it very clear. There is no conclusion on which we can finally agree. We might agree now, but we need to be open to more research. We need to be open to new ideas. We need to be open to changes. And Martin Luther, I think, would, in principle, agree with that. But Martin Luther closed several of his treatises with the statement: "Those who can challenge the research I've done, let him do it," because Luther believed, and it's probably fair to say, nobody worked harder than Luther. Nobody researched more than, I mean, he was like the greatest student in European history. So this question really addresses all of those things and confronts all of those things and asks students to admit the obvious. The obvious is that because you believe something, it isn't true for you. That's not what makes something true. Because a student believes that the earth is flat doesn't mean that the earth is flat. But a student will say, well, it's true for me. And what they mean by that is possibly two things, but the area is gray. They mean by that therefore in my mind this is the way that it works. But they also mean this is my experience. And it isn't their experience. Their experience has to do with gravity and curvature of the earth, and that the earth is rotating around the sun, and all of those things that are true and that are correct. Now there's a lot of things that we don't know about. But so the question then applies this to Luther and Galileo. And it gives the students an opportunity then to reflect back on their own thinking. Because some of these people who do this project will have said this, and certainly some will have heard this. Why would neither Luther nor Galileo, both proponents of freedom, endorse such a relativistic principle? And the answer, I think, is clear. Galileo would say, it doesn't matter if you believe that or not. Luther would say, would go further than that and extend this into the realm of divine retribution and punishment. Luther was a tough guy. Luther was a rough guy. Project21 on page 113. But since I said that, I should add something else. There is so much published by Luther, about Luther. His table talks go on for volumes and volumes and volumes. He was followed around everywhere he went by graduate students who wrote down every single word that he said. If people want to assert that Luther was a misogynist or Luther was an anti-Semite, you can find things. You definitely can find them. And so but he's a complicated person. You could find the opposite as well. He appears to have great respect for his wife, who he kidnapped from a convent, which was common practice, and he encouraged that for Protestants. Go kidnap a Catholic nun and marry her, and then respect her. Well, I'm not sure about that. But then Project22 on page 113 these are questions about the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and again, this is a model. The Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen is a model for the Korean Constitution, the American Constitution, the Constitution of India, for all of the constitutions that follow a humanist model. This is what the students are reading in this book, and then they can apply it to other circumstances. In what way is the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen enlightened? Question number one. My question is simply to get students to use the term enlightened to mean humanist, because enlightened is really a more graceful term, and it's more easily used, I think, as an adjective than is the word humanist. Number two, which passage endorses the enlightened principle of equality? Question number three is also about equality, because with those three principles of humanism says that every human is born free to reason as an individual. That makes people equal, and so it's logical that people are equal. It follows, but they don't all say that people are all equal. Particularly, they don't say that men and women are equal. But then in the 20th century and beyond, maybe, I don't know, post-Darwin, people are also asserting that people of different colors and different races are somehow different species. And the principle of species comes up later in this project. Question three is the same thing. You can see we're not equal. We aren't equal. So what do the humanists, and this would be from the Enlightenment principally on, what do humanists who say that all people are equal, what do they mean? Because we aren't equal. I can't jump as high as any of my students or run as fast, but still I believe that as a human being I'm equal to them. And what does that mean? And it also relates to the issue of what does humanity mean? What does it mean that I have humanity? Because a government can torture people and beat people and chain people up, and yet people say that that person is still a human being. But that person can't speak freely, that person can't worship freely, that person can't do any of the things freely, that person isn't free to reason. Well, but wait a minute, maybe that person is free to reason. And maybe humanity has something to do with that. Question number 4, which passage of the French Declaration suggests women should or should not be included in the public process? Again, this is just a question. The answer is there are a lot of correct answers to this question and some incorrect answers. Are there passages, question number 5, are there passages that could endorse discrimination on the basis of skin color? Which key word that appears in these passages might be perverted or used to defend a discriminatory practice? This is an interesting question because it kind of separates students by optimistic or naive, maybe, with cynical or pessimistic. Because there are words that cynics have manipulated from these documents to discriminate against people for voting, for citizenship, and so on. And what a humanist will need to do, and what the Greeks did, was, I think, sincerely, but clearly the evidence wasn't in their favor or on their side. They simply said women were not humans. They weren't human in the same way that men were human. And this means that all humans can become citizens or have the innate capacity to be citizens and to be humanists. Oh, but women aren't humans. And I think there was a parallel behavior in the United States and in American history, which raises the United States in world history, which is this one page on 115. And then the project isn't, it's not one of the best described projects, I think, in the course. But once students get it, it makes a lot of sense. There are traditions within American history, within the history of American institutional life, public life, popular life, that were enlightened, and there are traditions that are not enlightened. And it's simply asking about these. So, institutions, I have a student's answers in front of me. Question number 1, identify historical or present in the United States that demonstrate continuity with humanist values. Institutions, the Supreme Court is humanist in that it preserves equal justice under the law. Yeah, that seems good. Laws, the Civil Rights Act is humanist. Then the second part is those trends or institutions that are not enlightened. And this person says Jim Crow laws, the Catholic Church because it practices discrimination based on faith, popular culture, Cosmopolitan magazine is not humanist as it promotes the objectification of women, and so on. So I think those are all strong answers. That's a good student. I hope you enjoyed this. This is kind of in some ways it's a pivotal chapter. The material is pivotal. It explains and justifies the course. And this is one thing about, I understand why Western Civ courses were replaced with world history, and I fully endorse that. But it can't be denied that a modern higher education based on scientific principles and modern professional values is rooted historically in the United States, is rooted historically in a humanist tradition. So I think that to understand the class that we're taking and the conversations we're having and the Socratic method and the insistence on justice and the insistence on freedom and all of those things that come with humanism, I think it's essential to this class. I think that's also why I've had professors write and say, hey, can I just use that one chapter? By the way, I would answer, I mean, I guess, but you should write the publisher and see what they say. All right, thank you. And next we get to the individual and the institution in history. Bye.